Hi everyone, more photo editing practice today. I hope you're ready. I'm ready. It's great if you can play along at home, I guess. Open up one of your photo editing apps, find a photo you've been wanting to work on, and play along with me. That'd be great. Otherwise, just watch along and you might pick up a thing or two. But as always, I like to say that I'm a perpetual student rather than an expert, so everything I do is a learning process. Hopefully, you can join along with me on my learning journey. Okay. Let's get things started. Okay, here we are. So, I've got this photo here that I'm quite happy with. I took it yesterday in Roselle. You can see up here, Cullen Park, Roselle. I wanted to just point out this bit here. It says CR2. That's a RAW format, and basically it just means there's a lot of information in this file. So there are, a JPEG you're probably familiar with, or a PNG. But with this RAW file, you've just got a lot more information to play with, basically. Like the files generally, I don't know, a JPEG might be 2 megabytes or something, and this one's, 20. I'm just pulling those numbers off the top of my head, but you can see there's like 10 times as much information in there, and it just means there's a lot more to play with. So when you do get to editing, there's a lot more you can do, and some of it you won't see, but it'll be there sort of laying dormant, ready for you to tweak and play around with and have fun with. So I always advise editing in Camera Raw format. You can edit JPEGs and stuff though, but it's just a lot more satisfying when you've got more information to play with, because more information just means better, subtleties, I suppose. Anyway. Probably most of you already know that, especially if you're photographers already, but just remember, always best to start in Camera Raw and then you can export later as a JPEG, if you're going to put it up online or something like that. Okay, that's a little bit of a hint for you. And just while we're on hints, you can see here a few of the camera settings I used for this, and ISO 100 is always my other big hint. It makes for a less grainy image, and it does mean you have to have quite a lot of light in your scene, and this is where I'd quite often make the decision to add light if I was in a shooting something in natural light and I couldn't get to ISO 100 and it was a person. Maybe I'd then go and add a flash or something like that in, so you can get back to ISO 100, because the further you go up, so 200 compensates for the scene being a little bit darker, and so does 400, and it goes to 800 after that, and so on. And it's to do with the old film grains, basically. It's a technical thing, which I've forgotten. I learned it once. Something to do with the size of the film, the grains on actual 35mm film. ISO 100 meant there was 100 somethings per something. I can't quite remember. But it's called like the speed of the film, and it's sort of transferred across to digital, and you still get the best details at ISO 100. And if you went down to 800 or 1600 or something, you'd probably more than likely start to see some grainy bits where the software is trying to boost the dark patches too much, and it doesn't have all the information because there's not a lot of information in the shadows. I hope some of that makes sense. If it didn't, I'll keep talking about it in future weeks and sort of reiterate things as, they dislodge from my brain. But yes, try and keep your camera setting at ISO 100 if you can, and then adjust your other bits and pieces here. So the f-stop and the speed of your shutter there, to compensate for, to let enough light in to keep your camera set to ISO 100. Just as a general rule, you'll get a more satisfying photo in the end, especially when you're doing some quite heavy photo editing. So, that being said, I thought I'd do something a bit more heavy-handed today with the photo editing. But of course, always what we do before we do the fun, artistic side of things is we try and, squeeze the best possible exposure out of the image first. So, to do that, I sort of look at what is wrong with the photo to my eye, and then what is wrong with the photo to the eye of the software, which you can sort of see here in the histogram. It's not too bad. So let's start with what's wrong to my eye. Although there's quite a lot of stuff going on over here, really the focus of this photo I would like to be the outhouse here. I suppose that's what it is, the little hut. So I'd like to draw people's eye more to this. I'd like to see these trees, they're a bit dark. I'd love to get some more information out of those, I suppose. This side, if the outhouse is the main focus, actually the most light is kind of on this bit of the wall that the sun's hitting, and that's drawing your eye more so than the door, and the door is probably the bit I find most interesting. So I'll be looking at trying to fix that. And then maybe this sky over here is a bit bright and drawing your eye away from the outhouse, especially because there's this sort of leading line of the path that takes your eye towards that. And the lean of the trees and the sort of tunnel effect that it's getting and the perspective of the wall and all those bits are drawing you to this bright patch of sky back here. Whereas maybe that bit of sky isn't the most interesting thing in the photograph, depending, it's all subjective. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm looking to fix, and then what the software wants me to fix is, see, it's telling me here, I don't know if you can see, as I roll my mouse over this little triangle, it's telling me that some of the information is being lost because it's crunched too hard into the shadow area, and it does highlight it for me. You can only see it a little bit just in the details here above the door. You see a little bit of blue. Why don't I turn the blacks down and you'll see it a lot better. See if I crunch all the information in the histogram into the shadow end, then roll. See, that's telling me where the information is being lost because I've pushed my settings too hard. So the software thinks you've got more information here. You're using that camera raw format. There is more information in the photograph here. If I turn the exposure up, you'll start to see what it means. So you can actually make out, now that I've cranked everything up, that there's a little lattice here, a little sort of scrimmy, wiry thing, which when the exposure is at normal, you can't really make out. So there is more information sitting there, and the histogram is telling me that because I just need to tweak the photograph a little bit, I'm not actually seeing what it is with my own eyeballs, which ultimately it's your eyeballs that are going to see it, not the software. But the software is giving you a little hint there. I hope that makes sense. Okay, probably blathered on long enough. Let's actually move some of the sliders because that's the fun bit. So I sort of know what it wants me to do technically. I can also see there's a lot of info down here in the shadows that I could move further towards, this center kind of section. So I usually try and start with the whites and blacks in a photo. And as always, I hold down Option when I toggle my whites and just move it around, and that tells me sort of like in negative where the information is lost because I'm pushing it too high. So in theory you want to completely, well, for my my practice, I like to get it so there's a completely black screen, because then when I take my finger off the Option button, you can see here that the histogram is kind of got a safe bit over here where I'm not leaning too far into the highlights and losing information. And the same with the black areas. See, I've pushed too hard there and it's telling me in negative where I'm losing the information. So I go the other way until everything disappears and it's completely white. And now all the information is at least being shown. You can see my little triangle here is no longer telling me. It's grayed out and it's telling me that I'm not losing any information because of, the settings are pushed too hard. But I'm still not seeing my little lattice up there. So I'm going to grab the shadows and see if I can move those up to a point where I start to see it. And as you can see, like once I'm about there, you do start to get a little bit of the detail. And it's pushing up the exposure of the trees, which was one of the sort of things that I'd noted earlier. I wanted to see more detail in the trees. So already, and I always love toggling between the original photo and... So you can sort of see already that some of those initial things that I earmarked as the quote-unquote problems I see with the photo are being fixed. So got a bit of detail in there. I can see a bit of the trees. Already I feel like the photo is a bit more... it's got more depth and dimension to it. And part of that comes from... when the shadows are just flat, the objects they're on start to look flat, especially something round like a tree. You have a highlight side and a shadow side. Whereas now that we've moved the shadows up a little bit, you're really getting that curve. Already, I don't know, it's already got something really nice that I like about it in there. Hopefully you can see it too, and if not, just ignore me. Now let's have a go at the texture. Again, it's always tempting to wind this right up as high as you can because suddenly you go, ooh, everything's crispy and sharp, but you know, you also want to be subtle about things. So I like to just wind it up until I notice it and then nudge it back a couple of little notches just to make sure I'm not getting overexcited. Same with clarity. You know, that gives a wonderful sort of filmic look, but there's something about it that now just looks too hyper-real for my own eye and my own liking. So I'm just going to wind it up until it's doing something nice. And then wind it back a little bit just to make sure I'm not getting overexcited by my own photo editing. Same with this one, just wind. And then nudge it a little bit. So it's a bit more subtle, but already I think, even from where we were, I just feel like the photo has more depth. And as you can see, now that I've done that, I am now heading back into the extremes of my histogram, which means I'm losing information in the highlights and the shadows now. I mean, I'm rolling my mouse over it and actually I can't see. I actually can't see what it's talking about, which means, you know, for our eye, I'm probably not losing that much information, but even so, why don't I just grab this little tone curve thing and sort of almost like compress it a little bit. If anyone does audio work, they'll know what I mean by compressor. So I'm compressing the signal, quote unquote, to make it sort of technically correct. Yeah, I don't know. I don't love saying technically correct too much because actually, ultimately, it's all about what your eye thinks is correct, isn't it? But for the moment, I'm quite happy with what I'm seeing. Right, now colors. Let me just check. I always just enable this profile corrections. This is something, actually, what I have done with this particular photo shoot that I've done, this batch, is on import. You can enable these two corrections here. So I'd recommend doing that if you can work that out. When you're importing, enable the profile corrections to the whole, just everything in the batch, and that saves you just ticking these two boxes. Because, you know, just as a thing, I like to switch them on. You'll see the most happening with this one. It's just correcting the fact that it's a round lens and a rectangular image, and round and rectangles don't always match up, so there's a bit of distortion happening right in the corners of our image, which you barely even notice in this, to be honest, but just as a matter of habit, I switch those on. Now, what I was thinking with this one is it could look very nice and atmospheric if it was black and white. So let's have a go at that. Yeah, there's something there. Yeah, I'll probably add quite a lot of color into this one. And actually what I am noticing now that we've switched to black and white is this big area down here, the sort of lawn. It's starting to get quite overbearing, maybe, if that's the right word. So I'll probably do something about that later, and still that little patch of sky at the back. I mean, we've almost lost, with the detail of the color gone now, we've lost what that path was. But what we can do is, if we remember what color it was, because we're now in black and white, this little color correction section here, it still remembers what the colors were. This doesn't really make a lot of sense, even now that I know what it does. But it remembers what used to be green, and you can change the luminance of it, sort of. Even though it's not green anymore, you grab the green fader and it picks what used to be green. Hope that makes sense. If not, just have a play with it. That's what I'd always encourage you to do. And you know what? It's always worth just having a little play with these to see what happens, you know. You never know, something nice might come out of it. Like we are getting a bit more of that path again if I play with this. So getting a bit more detail in the top of the shed there. Now let's have a go at the yellow one. Oh yeah, that's quite distinct. But, you know, it's drawing more. Gives me a bit more on that door there, which ultimately, I think I was saying, is the more interesting part of that building. So I'm going to keep that up a little bit. Aqua, I mean, barely anything's happening when I move the aqua one. You can see a little bit of something happening down here. Blah, blah, blah. The blue, yeah, you're going to see there's always, you know, blue in the sky, obviously. And you know what it does do though, is it plays a little bit with that side of the outhouse that's being hit by the sun, and it just takes out the stark contrast between the bit that the sun's hitting and the bit that the sun, you know, it's in shadow because of the trees. So I'll put that up a little bit, and that way the contrast's less and you are getting more of a flat surface there, which is what it actually is. Let's have a play with the purple. Again, barely anything happening. A little bit of detail on the trees happening, I suppose, so I can wind it up a little bit. Magenta. Okay. So, now in previous videos, I've used this sort of, you know, this mixer here with 3 color wheels all in one. But what you can actually do, there's a few different modes here, and you can just adjust them one by one. So that's the shadows. If you click across, that's the midtones. Click across, that's the highlights. And then one I don't think I've used in any of the other videos is sort of a global color grade. So let's actually just start with the shadows. You know, it's always the most satisfying. And you know, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I love blue shadows. I'm going to keep it extreme at the moment, but what's and by extreme I mean, see this little slider here. This is why I thought I'd jump into this today, because you can control with, like, directly on the color wheel with this little control, or you can control with the sliders that are sort of sitting below it. So the way I find this most effective is to pick the color on the color wheel rather than using, you know, you can pick it here in the hue. But you've got a little bit more control, I think, by picking the color on the color wheel, and then change the saturation of it from this slider, and you've just got a bit more throw, you've got a bit more distance in which you can be more selective about exactly how much blue you want to inject into the shadows of this photograph. So I don't know, you can see already there's something really nice going on when you add the blue into those shadows. It takes it away from just being a black and white photo to, you know, something a bit more artistic, you know, with depth. The midtones, this is always my least favorite, but for some reason, it's because it didn't used to be in Lightroom. You just had highlights and shadows, and so I'm just, you know, I'm just whinging because I don't like having to add a whole new control into my workflow, but it's here to stay, I imagine. And it matches up more if you're doing video editing and stuff. It matches up a little bit better with Premiere Pro, which is, you know, the Adobe's video editing product. Just tweak the color a little bit. Just going to reset this one. Go back to my shadows. Maybe I've gone a bit too heavy-handed. I mean, this is always it. You just want to be subtle. So to someone who's just walking past this, or, you know, just open it on a web page, they'll go, oh, that's a black and white photo. You sort of don't, I mean, it depends how affected you want it to be, but, you know, there's a hint of the depth of the color rather than immediately going, oh, that's been photoshopped, if you know what I mean. I hope that makes sense. And then, yeah, I always just wind it up so you can see exactly what color you're injecting. I'm going to give it a kind of sepia-ish look, I suppose. So that's sort of working for me, but again, just winding it back down so it's just a bit more subtle. Yeah, somewhere about there. It's starting to look a bit photoshopped maybe, but I did say at the beginning that this video was going to be a bit more heavy-handed, so why don't I leave it, still has the illusion of a black and white photo, I think, although it's just creeping a little bit across into a bit more photoshopped. And then the highlights. What do I want to do with the highlights? Jeez, so many choices. Oh, I didn't even crank up my... Oh, actually we've happened across something I quite like there. And that's actually why it's quite good to have to be able to see all three, because you can sort of pick complementary colors a little bit in the mixer. But let's work with these finer controls now. I mean, that's way too affected now. But if I just add in like slightest tingy touch, then I don't know. Sometimes you just can't explain what you're trying to do, even though I'm supposed to be making you a nice video. And it just looks, there's something about it that looks right. And if you sort of go, am I just being crazy? Have I gone too far? You can toggle it on and off and go, does it look better before I've done the grade or after? Before, after, before, after. And I think it looks, personally, I think it looks better after. So, I mean, quite often I'd just leave it there if I was doing a big batch, but, I did promise we were going to, do something a little bit extra today, so why don't I push it a little bit further? And so why don't I add a little global color grade? It's already got something there. I should crank this right up so I can see what I'm doing. I mean, that's completely different to everything, so it's going to add a little bit more depth, but I'm going to wind it right down. Do you know what I mean there? So again, going back to this, that red color I've added in is different to all these colors, but I'm just going to make it subtle. And then there's a blending thing you can do over back where I've got those three colors. Oops, sorry. I hope I'm explaining this well. It's so subjective, I think, that you just sort of, I mean, we're here to sort of practice it, I guess, because it is subjective. And really, this is just about practicing. So the more you do it, the more you'll sort of go, yeah, that looks good to my eye. And what looks good to me might look completely terrible to you or something like that. Yeah, so basically all you need to know from that is play around with those until you get something you like. And I'd always err on the side of let's keep it subtle. Having said that, there's still some problems with this photo that I see. So this ground here is very dark. I'm getting a lot still from this sky in the background, which is drawing my eye away from the outhouse. So here's a couple of little things we can do to fix that. And this is where it does start to get looking quite photoshopped. Oh, so I should explain what I'm doing here. I'll just show you quickly. So there's this thing, and you can see it comes up as red. And what that is, it's not actually adding red to the photo. It's telling me that it's a mask. And that's the part of the photo that once I've set this mask, it's going to be affected by what I do. So to see that practically, I clicked on this little rectangle here, then you click off the screen and drag inwards, and then it's added that mask here. And now you can see all my controls. They're sort of in this grayer box, if that makes sense. And that means that anything I do here is only going to affect that masked piece of the photo. So just for a laugh, I'll wind down the exposure there. So I'm taking it into the negative because this bit of the ground is drawing my eye too much. So I want to knock a bit of the brightness out of it. So let's see what that's done. Yeah, already that's quite good. Now you can edit what you've done. It's a little bit hard to get back to in Lightroom, but you click back on the tool and then this little grey thing comes up. And actually, while we're being heavy-handed, just going to knock it back a bit more and see what that does to it. yeah, so you see what I mean? Even now, I've just knocked the exposure out of this bright bit of lawn at the front. And already my eye is way much more on the outhouse here. But why don't we do something a little more extreme? Because not only do we have this lovely rectangular mask tool here, we've got a circle. And this works in a similar way, however you say that. But usually you click on the center of what you want to highlight and drag out and roughly get the shape. And you can see here from this line inwards, there's a feather. So that means that it's like a gradient within a mask. So it goes from being a solid mask to gradually no mask at all in the center of this ellipsis that I've made. Now everything in the photo is masked except this kind of section where the outhouse is, including that bit that I already masked, so the masks layer up. So everything is going to be affected once I drag this down. So let's have a look at what it's doing. Now, I'm actually quite happy with that. I'm glad that worked while I was demonstrating it for you in one fell swoop. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? Now your eye's really drawn to that outhouse more so than it ever was. And, I guess in an ideal world, you'd be getting more detail out of the trees again. I have sort of lost a bit of that dimension, but I think I've gained it back because I've really, with a different technique, I've gained that dimension again because I've really pulled everyone's eye to that outhouse sort of thing there by adjusting a lot of the exposure of the image, but leaving that one section sort of correct, quote unquote correct. And I guess the last thing I'd probably mask is, my eye's still being drawn by that bit of sky. So what we have here is a brush, and you can see that, you can draw your own mask. So you're not limited to the circle or the rectangle. Let me just undo that mask. And you can adjust the size of it. So it's the brackets for me on my keyboard just above the return. Hang on, I'll take it to a darker point so you can actually see it adjusting. See, that's just me hitting the right bracket to make it bigger. That's me hitting the left bracket to make it smaller. So let's make it about the size, and it tells you that, see how there's the plus in the middle? That's the center of your cursor. Then there's a ring, then an outer ring. That's sort of giving you an idea of how feathered it is. And feathering's just good because you can spot a hard edge quite often in Photoshop or similar products like this one. So it's sort of helping you out already by easing you from your correction into the rest of the photo, so you're not seeing like a jagged edge where you've done corrections. And I'm just going to lower it down a tiny bit because I have a feeling you might see some jagged edges. So it's not too bad. Let's just get that little bit there and knock the exposure out of it again. Maybe that was too much. Maybe I just need to redraw my initial mask. So I've just undone it there, and I'm going to start that whole process again. Just delete this one. You can just hit the delete key once you've selected it. It does that little thing there. And I'm just going to broaden the mask out a bit so I don't see my transition. Because then people will know that I spent all this time photoshopping in it and it's not just how it turned out. Okay. And I'll just do a bit more of a subtle one here. Yeah. Yeah. I think that looks better. You still see that the sky is there, but it's just got the edge knocked off it. And it's not pulling your eye away from the outhouse quite so much. So, I mean, I've done quite a lot to that one. And with every photo, there's so much more you could do. Like, again, I could go in here and probably... in fact, why don't I do that? Because I spent so much time at the top talking about this little grill up here. It's going to raise the exposure of that a little bit so we can see some of the detail. Now, that probably wasn't enough. So, you don't want to be too heavy-handed with the exposure, but I think that, you're getting a bit more detail there in the grill. I could knock the side out of this little bit here, just because I've been going on about how that side's catching my eye so much. But again, just be really subtle here, because yeah, I don't know. I can see my workings here across the top. But anyway, I might delete that one, but that just gives you an idea of what you can do. And you know, I could go through and make all these sides of the trees bright again, so you're getting the roundness in them. Having said that, I'm quite happy with the photo now, so why don't I leave it there? Hope you had fun. Thanks everyone.